Welcome to the show that discovers the spiritual and scientific universe, the Universal Learning Series. I'm your host, Sandy Andrew. On this edition of the show, we will be featuring the new book, An Enlightened Philosophy, Can an Atheist Believe Anything? By Geoff Crocker. This book challenges the stale confrontation between atheism and religion. Calling on his experience in industry and his interest in faith and values, Geoff Crocker offers a fresh interpretation of religion as strong myth from which to create personal and social values. Geoff argues that contemporary atheism, while a valid hypothesis, destroys a source of values without offering any alternative. The result is moral nihilism and a materialist, self-centered consumer society. This, he argues, is much less than a full understanding of human life and society. Geoff Crocker starts off by tracing the development of philosophy to an atheist position, arguing that metaphysical concepts, an aspect of faith, are essential to human life. He then suggests a reinterpretation of the religious texts as myth, offering a wide range of examples on themes of justice, love, the market, the role of the state, fear, resurrection, and sibling rivalry. This book may appeal to both secularists who are looking for believable interpretation of faith and to Christians looking for a relevant interpretation of faith. Please visit Geoff Crocker's website at enlightenedphilosophy.com. enlightenedphilosophy.com. Link is on the main page of the Universal Learning Series website and will be on the archived show page as well. And we would like to welcome Geoff Crocker.
Hello.
All the way from the United Kingdom.
Hello.
To the Universal Learning Series radio show. Hi, Geoff. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon in the United States, and it's coming into evening time in the United Kingdom.
Great.
Okay. All right. Your book. Let's start off with this question for you, Geoff. Can you define atheism for the audience, please?
Well, I see atheism as just a simple belief that there is no God, a lack of persuasion that there is a God, a conclusion after considerable philosophical thought that no actual external God exists. And that's a view that the philosophy community, certainly in Europe, has taken on board very strongly since the development of thought by David Hume and others as to the question as to whether there is actually a separate soul. So Hume's conclusion, and one that's followed by a lot of contemporary philosophers, was that there is no separate soul, and therefore that humanity is purely physical. Now, as I say in the book, when you look at the reasons for the development of atheism, more strongly, of course, in Europe than in the USA, you add to that a couple of continental wars and the misery that came through those, and you look at the history of religion itself, particularly in continental Europe, and there are a lot of reasons for the development of secular atheism in European society.
Okay. Now, Geoff, in your younger years, you used to speak about Christianity and the Bible in particular, correct me if I'm wrong, but then you had a change. May I ask what made you switch from preaching the Word, so to speak, or discussing the Word, onto a more middle-of-the-road position?
Yes, that's true. I went through a change phase in my life when a lot of reconsiderations took hold in me. One of them, I have to say, was a sad behavioral issue in the number of faith communities that I saw. In other words, it's an old observation that people who have faith don't necessarily let that faith inform better behavior. And one can at times become quite significantly disappointed by that. The other, actually, though, was a real reinterpretation of some of the specific things we were saying within evangelical Christianity. And one of the points I make in my book is that there is a critique of the concept of forgiveness as it is defined within the evangelical faith, and that is that forgiveness, as God gives it, is only available if somebody else is punished, i.e. the message of atonement is that God forgives because he punishes his son. Now, the more I thought about that, the less I found it credible. There is a standard of forgiveness that we as human beings practice, which is actually superior to that concept. In other words, I forgive someone absolutely freely, not with any need to punish anybody else. So the more I thought about it, the more the concepts of propitiation and expiation that are proclaimed in the evangelical faith became inadequate for me. It was a very serious issue for me. So I then had to start to think about how one might discover some other definitions that were more believable. The other thing was that I was working in Russia for about 20 years of my life, and I saw a society which had been successfully, by the authorities, by the Leninist Marxist authorities, successfully forced into an atheist position. So people actually had no faith. That was true of the large part of the society, and yet people with significant sets of values. So all of those contributed to my reinterpreting what my own belief would be.
Okay. We'll get into the nuts and bolts of your book here in a minute, but I do want to ask you from a professional opinion, what's the trend in today's world regarding religion and atheism? What do you see as a man on the street? What's the trend, Geoff?
Well, I think that the trend is about to change, frankly. I think that the whole self-confidence of Western society has faced with a new crisis, and that new crisis is going to cause some fresh questionings about what we can really achieve and who we really are. So the great confidence of the consumer age that each of us could have, roughly speaking, in the developed world, anything we like, that we were masters of this world, that we could achieve in medicine, we could achieve in engineering, we could achieve in technology, that confidence is being rather shaken. And I think the inadequacy of a purely physical view is also becoming clear, and people are beginning to wonder there surely must be more than simple physicalism. There is something to do with us having values of thought and ideas and loves and all of those emotions, and there is a spirituality. So my feeling is that for the person on the street, there is a yearning again in the European context for something, shall we say at least something spiritual in their understanding of life. Now, I know in the American context that spirituality is more widely accepted. In Europe, it's been rather trampled on, but is beginning to re-emerge, and I hope that my book contributes to that re-emergence and perhaps gives it some definitions on its way.
Geoff's book is titled An Enlightened Philosophy, Can an Atheist Believe Anything? Now, the title may appear to be a bash on the atheist, but from reading your book's materials and the table of contents, I get a very strong sense that you're not bashing anybody. You're taking a more of a middle of the road, a sensible center approach, and you're saying to the atheist community, look, there is some things out there that you can't explain, and particularly love and emotions that's very difficult to quantify. So there is something beyond the material world, and then you're kind of saying to the religious community, say, look, what you're talking and preaching about and hammering home is starting to get outdated and meaningless in the 21st century. Am I correct in my initial observation of your work, Geoff?
No, you're absolutely right there, Sandy. I mean, the challenge I have for atheism is that, okay, if it's pushed to its ultimate conclusion, then we are only physical. Now, one might accept that hypothesis, but nevertheless, there is a metaphysical element to life, and I give the example in my book of an idea. You know, you can convey an idea to another person and multiply it by 2 without any increase in mass. you can convey it by the internet or by radio to thousands of people. The idea multiplies 1,000 times, but there is no increase in mass. So there is something in this universe, in this world in which we live, and in our humanity, which is more than simply the physical mass of whom we are. There is an added value, at least an idea here, also therefore a spirituality. So to the atheist position, which ends up with pure physicalism and a pure materialistic consumer society, I'm raising the creative challenge of saying, hey, metaphysical elements really do exist. They are part of humanity. To the religious point of view, I'm saying, well, the doctrinal interpretation of religion has certainly failed to convince a significant part of the population, and as I say, more so in Europe, but also there will be sections of the American communities that find the doctrinal interpretation impossible to believe. And I'm therefore saying to the religious part of society, look, in fact, the misinterpretation of religion is far more meaningful, is far more powerful, is far more relevant than the doctrinal one. And several of the examples I give in the book, I really say that there is no doctrinal interpretation possible of these examples. There is actually only a misinterpretation. And you get meaning rather than simply belief. So in some of the examples I give, for example, when Christ cleansed the temple of the market, whether or not I believe in that historic event really has very little meaning for me. But when I look into the meaning of the event, that market phenomena might not be allowed to rule over every element of human life, then I've got some very great significance there. So religion interpreted as myth, rather than weakening it, actually strengthens it. And again, when you look through the great discourses of Christ, my claim would be that it isn't riddled with doctrine and it isn't formulated doctrinally. Actually, it's hugely full of powerful moral parable and myth.
Good stuff. Jeff, let's look at the content of your book, An Enlightened Philosophy, Can an Atheist Believe Anything? The word synthesis is very common throughout it. What are you talking about when you're on this possible synthesis?
Right. Well, what I'm really therefore saying to each side in this argument, certainly what has become an argument in intellectual circles between atheism, which has become pretty militant atheism and religion, that this head bashing is really a dead end. It is a confrontation. It's not getting us anywhere. No side is being able to add any value to anyone else. Whereas, if there is this synthesis between the two, which we've just been discussing, i.e. the acknowledgement from the atheist perspective that metaphysical elements do exist, the acknowledgement from the religious perspective that myth is a very powerful interpretation of the religious tradition, then we've got a synthesis which really has appeal. It has application. It has meaning. And I'm suggesting that this synthesis really is something that the world beyond those atheist and religious groups, the general world that we all inhabit, will find very valuable. So that's what I mean by a synthesis.
You write in your book a little bit about Darwin and Dawkins. Yeah. Can you talk about that, please, for a few minutes?
Yes, because as you know, Darwin was seen both in Europe and subsequently in significant arguments, including legal arguments in the United States. Darwin was the break point that ushered in a period of very great questioning of religion because it seemed to confront creationism. Now, my take on that in the book is, first of all, that there are significant uncertainties in the Darwinian account. Darwin is very interesting. He's certainly, actually, if you read his book, quite humble. There's a humility that comes through Darwin's writing in Origins of Species, which is actually quite refreshing. And he acknowledges that there are some significant unanswered questions in his own account. Nevertheless, it looked like a challenge because the fossil record pretty clearly showed that the species were not immutable, but that the species did appear to change through historical time periods. Therefore, of course, the challenge to the idea of a creator God who created all the species once and for all. There are, however, some very great uncertainties with the Darwin position. So whilst I am sympathetic to a lot of what he has to say, what he writes, and the questions that he raises. The issues outstanding, for example, of inheritance. I mean, Darwin believed that if there was a mutation, then subsequent generations of that same species would blend the mutation in further breeding. Now, that's a very difficult concept, because if you blend by inheritance, the mutation will blend back in and disappear. So he then had difficulty with defining whether species had to be geographically isolated for a mutation to be preserved through future generations. Mendel, the great Hungarian scientist, with his experiments on peas, of course, then came to the rescue with his analytic, which showed that mutation genes can be dominant rather than blend back in. But the other great challenge is the challenge of altruism. You know, if one animal shows altruistic behavior towards another animal, this appears to undermine the concept of pure selfishness in behavior. That's a challenge of altruism, which Darwin was very well aware of, and because of which he nearly abandoned his theory on several occasions. It persists. And although scientists like W.D. Hamilton have tried to show that altruism never actually exists in reality, and that all altruism as it appears is really driven by a selfish gene, the kind of title of Dawkins' book. Dawkins, incidentally, got the theory from W.D. Hamilton. Hamilton's thesis, interesting though it is, that it's only relatives that show altruism to each other because they bear the same gene, in my view, does not have empirical justification. Now, I have significant arguments with biologists and philosophers of biology here in the UK at academic level about this, but I've gone through all of the texts that they've sent me, and it appears to me it is not definitively shown in the empirical data at all. So all I would say is Darwin's hypothesis is interesting and good, but should by no means be taken in the totally confident way in which it is taken by the intellectual community. They place far too much confidence on it. It stands as a hypothesis, but it's not fact.
Right.
Doesn't mean on the other hand that the creationist position is right either. I think that there's a bit of intellectual humility required here to leave space for some doubt. I don't think we know the story. So, you take the giraffe. Did the giraffe's neck go up because the vegetation rose inch by inch at the same rate that the giraffe's neck managed to raise inch by inch? Or, according to more modern versions of the story of the giraffe, did it first of all evolve long legs to run away from its prey, and then evolve a long neck because it had to stoop down to drink? Now, these are all these Kipling just so stories, and it remains the case that the Darwinian theory still cannot explain in detail the evolution of any one single species.
Geoff, you write in your book about choice, cause, and chance. Can you talk a little bit about those, please?
Yes, I think these are interesting concepts, which is why I try to highlight them in the book. I mean, the Enlightenment gave the view that humans were able to exercise choice. It also had a very fundamental view that there was a cause for everything. Newton had discovered how the planets attracted one another, and he had sorted out what the actual mathematical laws of that attraction was. So we could explain things. We could suddenly explain everything. Now, of course, in some cases, that's right. And as I again point out in the book, we could explain why certain diseases like bubonic plague in Europe arose, and we could therefore work out what to do about them and correct them. We became masters of the universe to some degree, and not entirely, but to some degree, because we'd understood the reasons by which the universe worked. We had explanations, so there were causes. At the same time, we find that we're operating in a probabilistic world. Chance is out there, and you can in life put everything in as rational a framework as you like, and still find that your ideas or your action fails because some probability that you weren't expecting emerges. So it's extremely interesting that chance or probability characterizes the world we live in just as much as reason or cause does. It seems that however hard you press, you'll still find an irreducible probability distribution out there in the world. And in fact, if you look at many, many variables, you take the height of people in the population, for example, those variables so often follow the shape of a normal distribution curve. It's very interesting. We have no reason why that is, other than that there is a quintessential, irreducible element of probability out there in this world. And as I also say in the book, if we admit that probability exists, it's far more difficult to posit, to believe in a God with purpose, because purpose and probability just don't seem to go together.
Would you say that free will really is a part of life?
I think that free will is a part of life in the sense of we're free to decide what we will to do, but we're not free to decide what the outcome of that will is. So, our free decision has to face all of the other factors that determine outcomes. So outcomes are determined by inertia, for example, and I can put as much free will into a situation as I wish, but the inertia can be very high. My free will gets me nowhere. So free will also faces the probability issue. I can put as much free will in as I like, but I'm facing chance. I can put as much free will in as I like, but I'm facing cause, and I'm facing reason. There are all sorts of factors, the level of my capability, for example, or of other people's competitive capability. So I'm a great believer in free will. I think individual creative entrepreneurial action is a great thing. But you can get frustrated so easily because there are many other factors that determine the outcomes of our lives.
Thank you, Geoff. That was a great response to that question. Okay, in your book, you're talking about connections, physical, soul, divine, myth. Let's talk about the soul connection. What do you write in your book, An Enlightened Philosophy? Can an atheist believe in anything to do with the soul connection?
Yeah, well, my connection about the soul is that the history of philosophy, as I say, and you can read this very well in the wonderful book by Roy Porter called Flesh in the Age of Reason. From David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, onwards, there was a critique of whether there was a separate soul. And the conclusion by the atheist community that there isn't a separate soul led to an atheist view. Now, what I'm really saying is, okay, you may not think there's a separate soul if you're an atheist, but actually does that mean that you deny that there is any sense of soul at all? And I think most atheists will come back and say, no, we'll accept that there is some kind of separate, some kind of soul, even though it may not be separate from the physical. So the doctrine, the philosophical doctrine of prevenience, that the physical hosts everything, and that the time that I die, everything gets switched off, which is the atheist position. Nevertheless, for the time that I'm alive, there is something other than the physical switched on. There's something that we could call the soul switched on for the time that I'm alive. So all I'm saying there is that actually atheism and religion only disagree about the soul in the eternal context, whether eternally there is a human soul that survives the death of the body. They don't actually disagree on whether there's a soul there while we're alive, and surely that's a much bigger agreement.
That's a great point. That's a great point. What do you talk about the market, institutions, and the role of the state? What about them?
Yeah.
What about those?
Well, here again, I think that religion has a lot to say to us about social values. So particularly this question of the market. And I referred earlier in our discussion today, the way in which Christ drove the market out of the temple and reserved a place that was holy. Now, the interpretation I suggest of that myth in the Bible is that markets should not be allowed to define everything in our lives. So markets are a very useful tool. Of course, America is a free market society. Europe is a free market society, although it has more social elements to its concept of market, and it will regulate the market a little more and that kind of thing. Nevertheless, markets are a very useful construct. Its signals of price and its signals of profit guide us as to what we might think of doing, as to what our best endeavours may be. So market is much better than state in that sense, in giving freedom for creative economic activity. Nevertheless, once it reaches too far and puts a price on everything, it's overreached itself. And I'm interpreting the myth to say that cognitive humanity should stand up at times to the market. This thing we've created called the market is our servant and not our master, and it should not be allowed to do things that we don't want to do. So, for example, you can't buy friendship. You shouldn't be able to buy friendship. You can't buy love, and you shouldn't be able to sell that. These things don't have a price. Now, I think that at the same time, one can ask the question as to whether that might be true of education, whether it might be true of health. Now, again, in the American context, these things are far more often priced than they are in the European context. I'm just suggesting for debate that the myth says the market should be constrained and not define everything for us.
Okay. Jeff, let's end the discussion today with the subject hosting synthesis. What are you getting at the end of your book on that?
Yes, I was hoping to find somewhere that would take up this idea. So if the church, for example, in UK where I live, if the church maintains its current position, this is what we promulgate as our gospel, this is the ABC of salvation, these are the 39 articles of faith, these are the doctrines in which you have to believe to be a Christian, and that's the position and it's non-negotiable, then I think we prolong the current separation of church and society. I mean, we in Europe, as you probably are well aware, we get far less than 10% of people, less than 5%, engaged with church. So that would continue. If, however, church were prepared to say, okay, maybe there is another interpretation here, maybe quite substantial parts of the population might be interested in this interpretation, maybe there is something to mutually explore, then I'm suggesting that church might be able to help host this synthesis for those who find the synthesis valuable. So I end the book, as you can see, with a quote of two examples of the blessed life from the Bible. One is from Psalm 23 and one is from Matthew 5. And I'm really saying, I think that every human, every atheist should have access to these texts for consideration. They're not prescriptive, but they're there for consideration. And I find them great and rich literature with significant, substantial meaning to them. So I'm suggesting that the church might consider hosting a non-doctrinal debate and an exploration for those who find this synthesis may be appealing and of value.
Sounds like a good idea to me.
I don't know whether the church will agree.
Okay.
I've actually had some very nice responses from bishops in the UK, because I sent each of them a copy of the book. And one decided to disagree with me strongly, which is his right, but others of them were saying, this is interesting. So actually there is a readiness to consider the idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, most religions have a common theme at their core, and that is one of love. So if they follow that common core, then there's no reason why not to.
Yes. Well, here there's 98% of the people out there not touched by the church at all, and this is a way in which they might find some common embrace.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Okay, Geoff. Well, where can people buy your book in the UK and in the USA?
Well, Sandy, they can buy it on Amazon. That's the best way, I guess. I mean, the booksellers may have it in store, but it's certainly available there on Amazon. So just go to Amazon, Geoff Crocker, and Enlightened Philosophy. It's in stock and it'll come to you. We also have a website, which you've kindly put on your radio webpage, I see, which is enlightenedphilosophy.com, and there's a downloadable presentation there of some of the themes we've just been discussing, and there's a Facebook page where we can have discussions together. So those are the ways in which you can access the ideas and buy the book.
Excellent. Okay, Geoff, thank you very much for calling in from the United Kingdom today, and best of luck with your book and your work.
Sandy, thank you so much for the invitation to come on your show, and it's been extremely interesting to talk it through with you. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was Geoff Crocker, author of the book Enlightened Philosophy. Can an Atheist Believe Anything? Link to Geoff's website will be on the Universal Learning Series radio show archive page, 2011, and also a link to Amazon.com to buy his book. Thanks for listening today to the Universal Learning Series radio show, where we discover the spiritual and scientific universe. Bye-bye.